Welcome once again to the Men of Isaka YouTube video. We will be continuing with our series on injury time. We will be taking the second part of the theme, Mene Mene Tekel Part 2. By the grace of God, we want to be looking at the topic, Stop Entertaining the Goats Instead of Feeding the Sheep. We will be anchoring on our text, John chapter 21, verse 15 to 17. The church has a duty to shine and lighten the world, to ensure that truth prevails, as we can all see in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 to 16. She is to nurture believers, help nurse the wounded as she continues to reach out to the unsafe, to get them on board. However, today, what we see is a deviation from the ideal. It is most unfortunate that the church leaders are at the forefront of this deviation that we see today. Instead of nourishing or edifying the sheep, the church today is neck deep in entertaining the goats and milking the cows, while the sheep starve to death. Now, because we are going to be looking at entertaining the goats instead of feeding the sheep, I want to quickly say something brief about the goats and the sheep before we move on. Now, because we don't have all the time to talk about certain peculiarities about goats, one thing that stands out about goats is that they are very stubborn, disobedient, and independent. Goats represent a species in the flock of God's creation that are very stubborn, disobedient, and independent of the shepherd. They are not interested in following the shepherd for nourishment, but are always on their selfish pursuits. What about the sheep? The sheep, some outstanding features about the sheep are their gentility, obedience, and submission to the shepherd. The sheep, unlike the goats, depend on the shepherd for their livelihood. Now, with this brief, I want to just dive in to looking at our text properly. Church, especially church leaders, have basically three responsibilities to the sheep of God that they are called to lead. And we will see these three responsibilities in our text. The first responsibility is in verse 15 of our text. Jesus began with feeding the lamb, caring for the sheep, the young sheep. Now the question is, why did Jesus begin with feeding the lamb? The lamb here is referring to children, to the young believers. This category of believers need careful and intentional feeding if they must grow in the faith to maturity. In our second point, looking at from verse 16, care for the sheep. Here it is clear that Jesus wants us to focus on a lot of our attentions in caring for the sheep instead of focusing on the crowd, which you see most churches, most church leaders are doing today. The verb care here is giving attention or thought to the sheep so that they can grow and become mature to be able to reproduce their kind in the flock. This care is to be taken seriously to avoid misleading or damaging the sheep, as we could see in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 to 17. That is what the word. And with the word, if you care for the sheep, it will correct, it will rebuke, it will reprove, it will direct and counsel. And lastly, in verse 7, you discover that we have a duty to feed the entire sheep. We began with feeding the lamb, caring for the young. Why did Jesus begin with feeding the lamb? Jesus saw into the future that in the end time there will be a great neglect of the lamb by the church and its leaders. So Jesus emphasized on feeding the lamb first. And it is unfortunate that this neglect is done just to concentrate on milking the cows and entertaining the goats. Jesus is here raising a very serious issue for us. He wants us to prioritize feeding the sheep instead of entertaining the goats and milking the cow, as you could see in Zechariah chapter 10, verse 13. Brethren, it is time for the church, especially church leaders, to go back to the genuine word of God. Relate with believers as believers, not see them as trees to be exploited based on part one that we had of our theme, Mene Mene Tekel. The act of selling God's grace in the guise of using spiritual gift and talent to make money today is a dangerous sign of the injury time. And God is annoyed with this practice. The way the church and her leaders trade grace for the perishable is disheartening. And in this injury time, if you are not careful, you will regret this act. In conclusion, it is time we stop entertaining the goats, milking the cows, to prioritize feeding and caring for the sheep of God. This is what the Lord expects from us. This is our duty and purpose after being born again. You will agree with me that it is injury time. Seeing the aberration becoming the norm in most churches and with most church leaders, this is why there's a writing on the wall. Mene Mene Tekel. Time is up. God is annoyed with the church, and judgment has begun in the house of God. We must stop this nonsense and become actively involved in evangelism and discipleship. This is what God expects from us if we are truly looking for the King and the kingdom which is coming soon. For you, child of God, listening to me now, God is saying, come out of them and be different if you want to escape the judgment and eventual destruction of those indulging in entertaining the goat and milking the cows, as it is in Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 to 34. Brethren, before you leave our channel, we would love that you press the like button. If you are new, subscribe to our channels for the new videos, and we would enjoin you to share this. It might be just the needed video for your friend or relative. Remain blessed. Thank you.